This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone. Earlier today, the full card gallery for Murders at Karlov Manor dropped, and that means it's time to start my limited set review for the format. Over the next week or so, I'll be evaluating every single card in the set to get you ready for your pre-release or the release of this set on Magic Arena. We're starting today with the multicolored and colorless cards. Multicolored is always a nice place to start because it does a good job of introducing us to the set's archetypes and mechanics, and multicolored cards also tend to be some of the most powerful cards in the set. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about Draft and Sealed, I'm going to be talking about cards that can be found in Play Boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video. Play Boosters now also contain cards from the list and special guests. Combined, that's about 50 cards that are effectively a bonus sheet, and I'll be addressing those in their own video after we get through the main set. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, since the goal is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some things. However, as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have actually panned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the multicolored and colorless cards in Murders at Karlov Manor. Alright, our first card is the only colorless card in this set that's not an artifact, and that is Case of the Shattered Pact, which for 2 generic mana is an uncommon enchantment with the Case type. Case is a new enchantment type in this set, and as we read this card, I'll explain exactly what it does. So when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle, and then you can solve cases. All of them have some sort of requirement that is checked at the end step, and if you meet that requirement, the enchantment gains another effect. In this case, you have to have 5 colors among permanents you control, and then, once it's solved, at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gains Flying, Double Strike, and Vigilance until end of turn. A colorless source of fixing is a nice thing to have around, and this format has enough multicolored stuff going on that solving this isn't impossible, and obviously this case itself increases your chances of having a deck that lets you solve this because it fixes your mana. But I still think this will be hard enough to solve that most of the value comes from its fixing effect, and it will occasionally have some late game upside. One nasty thing about this particular case is that because it takes until your end step to get solved, your opponent can potentially keep it from happening by simply removing one of your creatures, something that isn't that hard. I think this is probably just a C, but I hope in my heart that I'm wrong, and that this is both an enabler and a payoff for legit 5-color decks in the format. Alright, let's move into the multicolored cards now, starting with Aclazotz, Spirit of Justice, which for 2 generic, a red, and a white is a 2/4 legendary spirit detective at Mythic Rare. He's got Double Strike and Vigilance, and when he enters a battlefield or attacks, you choose up to 1 target creature. If it's suspected, exile it. Otherwise, suspect it. And as a reminder, text tells you about this new mechanic, a suspected creature has menace and can't block. A 4-mana 2/4 with Vigilance and Double Strike is already a really good card, so adding Suspect to the mix is pretty nice. You can use this to remove an opposing suspect right away if there is one, and that's going to feel particularly powerful. But if there's not, you can choose to give something suspect, which can of course be beneficial when you want to turn off a creature's ability to block, or if giving one of your creatures menace is a big deal. And in the case of Aclazotz, you're probably usually going to want to make one of your opponent's creatures a suspect, so that when he does attack on the next turn, he can just exile it. Also, don't forget, Agris can target himself. You're not always going to want to, but adding Menace to Double Strike and Vigilance also is pretty good. But overall, you're getting a very efficient creature, and it's one that's going to have some sort of impact on the board right away, and if left unchecked, he's just going to win you the game between his great stats and his ability to remove opposing creatures. I think he's a bomb, giving him an A. Next up, it's Alquist Proft Master Sleuth, which for 1 generic, a white, and a blue, is a 3/3 legendary human detective at Mythic Rare. He's got Vigilance, and when he enters the battlefield, you investigate. This means you create a clue token, which is an artifact with 2 generic, sacrifice this artifact, draw a card, and you can pay X, a white, and 2 blue, tap it, and sacrifice a clue, and you draw X cards and gain X life. A 3-mana 3/3 with Vigilance that makes you a clue is a great starting point. And then in the late game, he can turn one of your clues into Sphinx's Revelation. Gaining life and drawing cards is a very powerful combination, as that life helps offset the fact that you just pumped a bunch of mana into something that didn't impact the board. You're not always going to manage to do that, but that's fine. His fail case is that you get a reasonably efficient 2-for-1, and the upside is that you pump a bunch of mana into his ability and there's no way for you to lose. He's knocking on the door of bomb status, but I think he falls just a little bit short because there are going to be a lot of games where you don't have time for that activated ability, and he's going to feel like a B+. Next up, it's Anzrag, the Quake Mole, which for 2 generic, a red and a green, is an 8/4 legendary mole god at Mythic Rare, and when it becomes blocked, you untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there's an additional combat phase. You can also pay 3 generic, 2 red, and 2 green, and Anzrag must be blocked each combat this turn if able. First Ilarg and now Anzrag, Gruul gods are something else. Anyway, a 4-mana 8/4 is probably a C+ or B-. Those are really above rate stats, and Anzrag comes with a bunch of extra upside. Getting extra combat phases is usually an effect that sounds super powerful but underwhelms, but attaching the effect to an 8/4 creature makes a difference. It's kind of hard for your opponent to just take 8 to the face in most situations, but that's what they're going to have to do frequently when he's in play. I mean, if they can block Anzrag but not kill him, there's really no point, and even if they can kill him and you have a well-developed board, your other creatures are going to untap and just swing again. The ability to force stuff to block him in the extreme late game is kind of silly, because by then it's pretty likely your opponent can just kill him and will want to kill him anyway with a couple of 2/2s or something. But if you have a well-developed board and you can force him to block, then they're still going to be in a world of hurt. I think he has such an efficient stat line, coupled with really powerful abilities, that he gets into the lower bomb range. I'm giving him an A-. Next up, it's Assassin's Trophy, which for a black and a green is a rare instant. It says destroy target permanent opponent controls. Its controller may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. This is a reprint, and it wasn't great last time. Sure, it can answer anything for a low mana cost, but don't underestimate the downside. Using this early is a really bad idea, since ramping and fixing your opponent's mana will often give them a game-winning advantage, and whatever small thing you dealt with early probably isn't worth the downside. That said, that downside becomes minimal the longer the game goes on, and the value of being able to deal with any permanent goes up too. Still, I think it falls below premium removal, because if you've got a removal spell that you can't really use in the early game, it's a lot harder for it to be premium. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Aurelia, the Law Above, which for 3 generic, a red and a white, is a 4/4 legendary angel at rare. She's got flying, vigilance, and haste, and whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card, and whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, Aurelia, the Law Above, deals 3 damage to each of your opponents and you gain 3 life. A 5-mana 4/4 with these 3 keywords is probably already a B+, so Aurelia's Pseudo Battalion and Super Duper Battalion abilities are pretty great. Because she's got haste and flying, there's a pretty significant chance you'll draw that card the turn you play her. Lightning helixing your opponent will be tougher, but not impossible. Keep in mind this does count when your opponent attacks you too, so it makes your opponent play the game a little bit differently in some situations as well. I think she's going to get in for damage and give you a 2-for-1 upfront often enough to be a bomb, giving her an A. Next up, it's Blood Spatter Analysis, which for a red and a black is a rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls. Whenever 1 or more creatures die, mill a card and put a Bloodstain counter on Blood Spatter Analysis, then sacrifice it if it has 5 or more Bloodstain counters on it. When you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is a great removal spell that turns into a 2-for-1 if the game goes long enough, while also stocking your graveyard, something you're going to want to do in this format. It's pretty hard to be upset with that. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Breakout, which for a red and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It says, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them. If that card has mana value 2 or less, you may put it onto the battlefield and it gains haste until end of turn. If you didn't put the revealed card onto the battlefield this way, put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is a neat take on the 2-mana card selection spell we often get. This can still grab you a creature for 2 mana, like most of them, but I like the upside of getting a haste creature directly on the battlefield should you decide to take a lower mana value creature. This also means that provided your deck has a good number of 1s and 2s, this is something you can play on curve and add to the board with a decent chunk of the time. Something that isn't true of most sorcery card draw spells, and then this still has the upside of digging for a big bomb in the mid to late game. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Buried in the Garden, which for 2 generic, a green and a white, is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant land. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent you don't control until Buried in the Garden leaves the battlefield, and whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of any color. Well, this is pretty good. So it's an Oblivion Ring stapled to an aura that fixes your mana. That's hard to be upset about. Removal plus fixing and ramp just isn't something we see together all the time. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Coerced to Kill, which for 3 generic, a blue and a black, is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. You control enchanted creature. Enchanted creature has base power and toughness 1/1, has death touch, and it's an assassin in addition to its other types. This is great. Mind control effects are incredibly strong, and even though this one weakens the creature in most cases, you still remove an opposing creature and get a 1/1 death touch that can trade for anything. I mean, imagine that this was a 5 mana sorcery that gives you a 1/1 death touch and destroys a creature. That would be an awesome card, and that's basically what this is. The creature actually keeps any abilities it has too, so sometimes it'll be better. Importantly, this is very effective at getting you back ahead from behind, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Crowd Control Warden, which for 3 generic, a green and a white, is a 4/4 Centaur Soldier at common. As it enters the battlefield or it's turned face up, put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of other creatures you control, and it has Disguise for 3 generic and 2 green-white hybrid mana. Disguise is a new mechanic in the set that is very reminiscent of an old one. It's basically Morph, except in addition to being a 2/2 that you can play for 3 generic mana face down, it also has Ward 2. This looks like a really good common. It'll be at least a 5/5 frequently, and other times it'll just be massive. The whole Disguise thing is a big deal too, because when this creature has the potential of being this big, it can do a ton of damage out of nowhere. I also really like that there's a common cycle of hybrid mana disguisers, which means they'll fit into more decks than they would otherwise. I'm giving this one a B-. Next up, it's Curious Cadaver, which for 2 generic, a blue and a black, is a 3/1 zombie detective at uncommon. It's got flying. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you return it from your graveyard to your hand. A 4 mana 3/1 flyer is kind of a liability. Sure, it can hit the opponent reasonably hard for the cost, but it also dies to everything, including lots of cheap removal spells and creature ETB abilities. This offsets that because it can come back from your graveyard, but don't underestimate how much of a pain it is that you have to keep recasting it. Sometimes you just don't have time for that. Still, it's an evasive creature with reasonably high power that doesn't stay dead, and overall that's definitely something I'm interested in. I could see this underwhelming in the end if that 1 toughness is extra easy to deal with in the format, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Deadly Complication, which for 1 generic, a red and a black, is an uncommon sorcery. It says choose one or both. Destroy target creature. Put a +1/+1 counter on target suspected creature you control. You may have it become no longer suspected. 3 mana to destroy a creature at sorcery speed, already premium removal. So, the fact that you can also sometimes put a counter on one of your creatures and make it not a suspect anymore is serious business. The black-red deck is the deck in the format most interested in the suspect mechanic too, so you can imagine having a creature around to take advantage of this upside. It'll feel amazing when you can get the counter and kill something, but I don't think it's going to happen so often that this is insane. Still, it is really, really good, giving it a B. Next up, it's Detective Satchel, which for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is an uncommon artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you investigate twice. You can tap it and make a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token with flying, activate only if you've sacrificed an artifact this turn. So, blue-red is all about sacrificing artifacts, and this gives you 3 of those up front, and then it can give you an amazing payoff for sacrificing artifacts, which of course can include your clue tokens, since you can get a 1/1 flyer out of it every time that happens. I don't love that it doesn't add meaningfully to the board the turn you play it most of the time, but the engine potential here is very real. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Dog Walker, which for a red and a white is a 3/1 human citizen at common. It's got Vigilance and Disguise for 2 red-white hybrid mana, and when it's turned face up, you create 2 tapped 1/1 white dog creature tokens. This is another nice common disguise hybrid card. Obviously, you get the most value out of just casting it face down and turning it face up, at which point you pay 5 mana for a 3/1 Vigilance and 2 1/1s, and paying that on installments will make it feel more efficient than that. But the fact you can also just slam it on turn 2 if you're more interested in curving out is pretty nice, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Doppelgang, which for 3X, a green and a blue, is a rare sorcery. For each of X target permanents, create X tokens that are copies of that permanent. So 5 mana, let's say, to make a token copy of a permanent isn't that great. Obviously, it's highly dependent on what you copy, but when you're evaluating a card like this, you have to think about how often you're actually getting 5 mana worth of value, and there will probably be more times where you don't get your mana's worth. Still, when you cast this, you're going to get a copy of whatever the best permanent is on the battlefield. Most of the time, that'll be a creature, and that means you either have a copy of your best creature or a copy of your opponent's best creature, and then this has late game upside where you can pump a bunch of mana into it, and it can be really crazy, but it's still clunky enough that I'm not that excited about it. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Drag the Canal, which for a blue and a black is a rare instant. Create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. If a creature died this turn, you gain 2 life, surveil 2, then investigate. If this was always 2 mana to make a 2/2, you gain 2, surveil 2, and investigate, it'd probably be an A-. That's just some really, really insane value. Obviously, it isn't always going to line up that way. There are going to be times where it's just 2 mana for a 2/2 with flash, and that's certainly nothing special. But that's the fail case, and then the card has this really high ceiling. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Atrata, Deadly Fugitive, which for 1 generic, a blue and a black, is a 1/4 legendary vampire assassin at Mythic Rare. She's got Death Touch, and face down creatures you control have 2 generic, a blue and a black. Turn this creature face up. If you can, exile it, then you may cast that exiled card without paying its mana cost. And whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent, cloak the top card of that player's library. Cloak means that you take that card and put it onto the battlefield as a 2/2 with Ward 2. A 1/4 Death Touch for 3 is a pretty good starting point, and her abilities are strong. Basically, when she, or potentially another assassin, there are a few others, though not a ton, but when one of them hits your opponent, you make the top card of your opponent's library a creature token, more or less, except it has way more upside. That's already something I love, even if it was just a token, but then you have the ability to turn those cards face up. And in the case of Atrata, she can even allow you to cast spells that aren't creatures. So if you hit your opponent's removal spell with it, you can turn it face up for 4 and then cast that removal spell. So it's going to be very hard for you not to get value out of the cards that she does cloak, because you're always going to be able to turn them face up thanks to her activated ability, whether they're creatures or otherwise. So she's a reasonably efficient creature that's a real pain to block because of Death Touch. And then she has the ability to give you all of this card advantage. She's pretty good, giving her a B+. Next up, it's Evidence Examiner, which for a green and a blue is a 2/2 Merfolk Detective at Uncommon. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may collect evidence 4. Collect evidence is a new mechanic that lets you exile cards from your graveyard with a total mana value equal to that collect evidence value, in this case, 4. And whenever you collect evidence with Evidence Examiner in play, you get to investigate. So blue-green is one of the decks most interested in collecting evidence. This can turn cards into your graveyard into cards in your hand, and it gives you a repeatable way to collect evidence, something that seems particularly useful in this set because there are payoffs that give you something when cards leave your graveyard. Overall, though, this doesn't seem strong enough to pull me into this particular 2-color combination. I think it's just a C+. Next up, it's Ezrim, Agency Chief, which costs 1 generic, 2 white, and 2 blue, for a 5/5 legendary Archon Detective at Rare. He's got flying. When he enters the battlefield, you investigate twice. You can pay 1 generic and sack an artifact, and Ezrim gains your choice of Vigilance, Lifelink, or Hexproof until end of turn. So he offers great stats, and his ability to gain powerful keywords is amazing, especially because he gives you the clues to sacrifice to protect him with Hexproof. Most of the time, you're going to want to wait to play Ezrim until you can leave that mana up, because at that point, your opponent is probably entirely unable to deal with him, and that's a problem because he ends the game in just a few swings. The card's only downside is the mana cost. Double white, double blue isn't always easy to assemble in Limited, and the longer you have to wait to cast Ezrim, the less impressive he is. Still, he's a bomb. It's a big flyer that is incredibly difficult for your opponent to deal with. If it was easy to cast, I think he'd be an A+, but I think the hit on his mana takes him down to an A. Next up, it's Fairy Snoop, which for 1 generic, a blue and a black, is a 1/4 Fairy Detective at common. It's got Flying and Disguise for 1 generic and 2 blue-black hybrid mana. And when it's turned face up, you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard. A 3-mana 1/4 flyer isn't a disaster, and the Disguise upside here is pretty real. Drawing a card is always nice, and there's plenty of incentive for putting things in your graveyard too. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Gadget Technician, which for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is a 3/2 Goblin Artificer at common. When it enters the battlefield or it's turned face up, you make a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and it has Disguise for 2 blue-red hybrid mana. So if you play this face up, you get a pretty nice rate, and the Disguise option is obviously really nice too. You can add a body to the board out of nowhere, and obviously sometimes paying in installments is going to be better. Like if you can play this on turn 3, face down, and then on turn 4, you turn this face up and play a 2-drop. That's going to feel like a pretty good turn. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Gleaming Gear Drake, which for a blue and a red is a 1/1 Drake at uncommon. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate. Whenever you sack an artifact, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. I'm already on board with a 2-mana 1/1 flyer that makes a clue, and this thing will become a very real threat if it's left unchecked, as this format is replete with clue tokens, not to mention other ways to sacrifice stuff. In short, this card has a nice fail case and an amazing ceiling. Sometimes it'll feel like a 4-mana 2/2 flyer that draws you a card. It's also a card I'd love to play. And then it has all this other upside. This looks like a really strong signpost uncommon, one that is plenty strong to just pull me into the archetype. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Granite Witness, which for 2 generic, a white and a blue, is a 3/2 Gargoyle Detective at common. It's got Flying and Vigilance and Disguise for 2 blue-white hybrid mana. And when it's turned face up, you can tap or untap target creature. A 4-mana 3/2 with Flying and Vigilance is passable, so the Disguise upside here is nice to have around. Tapping or untapping things isn't always useful, but when it is, it can be pretty good. I'm giving this a C+. Next, there's Improbable Explosion, which for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is a rare sorcery. It says draw 2 cards, then you may discard 2 cards. When you do, Improbable Explosion deals X damage to each creature, where X is the highest mana value among the discarded cards. So this is basically a modal card. You can pay 4 mana to draw 2 at sorcery speed, which isn't great, but that is a mode you have. The other option is that you loot twice and then do damage to the entire board. One thing I like about this is you can make the decision after you draw those cards, obviously, and sometimes you're going to draw 2 and you're going to want to keep them both, depending on what the board state looks like, depending on what cards you drew, and sometimes you're just going to want to discard a couple of things and do damage to the whole board. And this is also a sweeper you have some control over. You know, if your opponent has a bunch of small creatures around and you just discard something that costs 2 mana and like a land, and you can just like kill all of their creatures, or a bunch of their creatures, and not hurt your board as much, it's going to feel pretty good. And then it still has the upside of being able to do a bunch more damage in the right situation. On top of all that, putting stuff in your graveyard is valuable in this format to begin with. So overall, I think this is a pretty good card. You know, I like that it has this fail case where you can just keep the cards. You know, a lot of cards we've seen in the past would make you draw 2 and then discard 2, and then the thing would happen. With this, you can make that decision. And I think that makes it pretty good overall. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Insidious Roots, which for a black and a green is an uncommon enchantment. Creature tokens you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, and whenever 1 or more creature cards leaves your graveyard, you make a 0/1 green plant creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. So you're likely to have tokens around sometimes in black-green, even absent of Insidious Roots, but you're really going to need to be able to get the plant stuff going on this for it to be worthwhile. The good news is black-green is one of the color pairs that's interested in collecting evidence cards, which will trigger Insidious Roots, but this still kind of asks a lot of you. You need a stocked graveyard, you need the things in your graveyard to be creatures, and then you need to collect evidence. I think that's doable, but still hard enough that this probably needs a build-around grade. It's probably a D+ in a lot of black-green decks, but a C+ if you can really get there on synergy. I am a little worried this is an archetype that will be too slow to come together, but I hope I'm wrong. Next up, it's Izoni, Center of the Web, which for 4 generic, a black and a green is a 5/4 legendary elf detective. At rare, she's got Menace, and when she enters the battlefield or attacks, you may collect evidence 4. If you do, you make 2 2/1 black and green spider creature tokens with Menace and Reach, and you can sack 4 tokens to surveil 2, then draw 2 and you gain 2 life. This card's going to be pretty insane and limited. It reminds me of Ishkana, and that's good company to keep. In black-green, this will be a 6 mana 5/4 with Menace that makes those 2 tokens. a lot more often than it won't be, and on rate alone, we're already talking about a bomb, but then you add in the fact that she can trigger it again anytime she attacks, and because she has Menace, she's going to have pretty decent attacks pretty often, and then she also has the ability to throw tokens away to get some additional value. She's a pretty insane bomb, giving her an A+. Next up, it's Judith, Carnage Connoisseur, which for 3 generic, a black and a green, is a 3/4 human shaman at rare. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, choose one. That spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink, or create a 2/2 red imp creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So obviously, if your spell doesn't do damage, giving it Death Touch and Lifelink doesn't matter. But if it does do damage, well, that's a pretty big upgrade, because that spell can now kill anything while gaining you life. The good news is, when you don't really care about that first option, you have access to a second one that's also really good. Getting a 2/2 devil that damages the opponent when it dies is no small thing. Obviously, you do need a decent number of instants and sorceries to really get Judith going, as she's pretty bad if you can never use this trigger. But I think most black-red decks will have enough spells for her to be pretty good, giving her a B+. Next up, it's Kaya, Spirit's Justice, which for 2 generic, a white and a black, is a mythic rare legendary planeswalker Kaya with 3 loyalty. Whenever one or more creatures you control and or creature cards in your graveyard are put into exile, you may choose a creature card from among them. Until end of turn, target token you control becomes a copy of it, except it has flying. She's got a +2 that says Surveil 2, then exile a card from a graveyard. And she's got a +1 that says create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. And she's got a -2 that says exile target creature you control. For each other player, exile up to 1 target creature that player controls. So all 3 of these abilities are awesome. The +2 gives you serious card selection and lets you hate on the graveyard, or alternatively exile something from your graveyard so that you get some value out of her ability. And it also raises her loyalty to 5, which is a lot if you're playing her on turn 4. Her +1 can protect her and or pressure your opponent, and her -2 is basically Bone Splinters with huge upside. Obviously enough, the -2 and +1 synergize with her triggered ability. The +1 makes sure you have tokens, the -2 exiles stuff, so you're going to get some extra value out of all of that. I think she's a huge bomb. I'm giving her an A+. Next up, it's Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy, which for 2 generic, a blue and a green, is a 3/4 with flying and vigilance. And when he attacks, you destroy up to 1 target artifact. If you control that permanent, draw a card. He's also got an adventure, because he's from Eldraine. There's not another card with an adventure in the set. Just like in the last set, he was the only adventure. This one is Tail the Suspect for a green and a blue. It's a sorcery, and you investigate, and you can play an additional land this turn. When you cast a card with an adventure, it gets exiled, and then you can cast it as a creature later. So, even without the adventure side, this is a really good card. The format has plenty of artifacts for him to destroy, and they'll be on both sides of the table, so you will often get something with the trigger, in addition to having a nicely statted flyer. The investigate side is great too, though keep in mind you're not always going to get much out of the ability to play an extra land. Still, it's upside on a card that is already good, and obviously makes a clue before you play Kellen, and that gives him some synergy with himself. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Crawl Whipcracker, which for a black and a green is a 3/2 insect assassin at uncommon. It's got reach, and when it enters the battlefield, you destroy a token an opponent controls. There are a lot of tokens in this set for sure, but destroying most of them isn't typically worth a card, and this won't have a target that often. The stat line isn't really above rate these days either, so I think this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Kylox, Visionary Inventor, which for 5 generic, a blue and a red, is a 4/4 legendary Viashino Artificer with Menace, Ward 2, and Haste. And when it attacks, you sacrifice any number of other creatures, then exile the top X cards of your library, where X is their total power. You may cast any number of instant and or sorcery spells from among the exiled cards without paying their mana costs. Menace, Haste, and Ward make it pretty likely you'll get one swing in with this. Problem is, giving up stuff on your board for the potential to cast free spells is pretty sketchy. Sure, you're likely to hit a couple, but you both need expendable creatures around and enough spells in your deck for this to do its thing, and it isn't always easy to make sure your deck has both of those going on. In fact, it's kind of hard to have both of those things going on because they have tension with one another. So I don't see this working out as often as you need it to, especially for 7 mana, giving him a C+. Next up, it's Kylox's Volt Strider, which for 1 generic, a blue and a red, is a 4/4 vehicle at Mythic Rare. It has Collect Evidence 6, and it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. When it attacks, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from among cards exiled with it. If that spell would be put into a graveyard, put it on the bottom of its owner's library instead, and it has Crew 2. A 3-mana 4/4 vehicle with Crew 2 is probably a D+ or so. Sure, it's got good stats for the cost, but it doesn't matter so much when you're having to tap a 2-power creature to get it going. However, being able to crew this without tapping anything is pretty nice, though you do need a reasonably well-stocked graveyard. Casting spells at exiles is where the value really comes in, but the fact you still have to pay for those spells is kind of sad after the evidence you put in. I think this needs a build-around grade, even in blue-red, because this set's blue-red archetype isn't spells. So it's probably a D+ in your typical deck in the format, but I can see it being a B in a deck that gets there on spells and graveyard stuff. Next up, there's Lazov, Wearer of Faces, which for a blue and a black is a 2/3 legendary shapeshifter detective at rare. When it attacks, exile target card from a graveyard, then investigate. And whenever you sacrifice a clue, you may have Lazov become a copy of a creature card exiled with it until end of turn. Hating on the graveyard has value in this set, and obviously so does getting clues. There are also going to be times where Lazov can become a pretty insane creature, and if you can attack and leave mana up to crack that clue, your opponent's going to be in a miserable spot, provided you have an exiled creature around. Even without that creature copying effect, we're still talking about a reasonably efficient creature that has really nice abilities. I'm giving Lazov a B. Next up, it's Leyline of the Guild Pact, which costs a green-white hybrid mana, a green-blue hybrid mana, a black-green hybrid mana, and a red-green hybrid mana for a rare enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you can begin the game with it on the battlefield. Each non-land permanent you control is all colors. Lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. So here's the card that can combo with that colorless case that we saw earlier, but this effect just isn't worth it in limited. We've seen that with cards like Prismatic Omen. You know, even if you put this into play for free, more often than not, it's going to feel more like you're mulliganing than anything else because the value it delivers is so minimal. Sure, you can try and make your 5-color deck work with this thing, but what do you do when you don't have the ley line? It just isn't going to do the job. I'm giving this an F. Next up, we've got Lightning Helix for a red and white, which is an uncommon instant that does 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life. This is a great reprint and an incredibly powerful removal spell. Don't underestimate just how good it is to simultaneously remove a creature and gain life. That can alter a game in your favor in a big way, and this can also just go after the opponent. It's certainly premium removal. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Meddling Youths, which for 3 generic, a red and a white. So 4 or 5 human detective at uncommon, it's got haste. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you investigate. A 5 mana 4/5 haste is kind of okay, and this can spit out clues in a format where they really matter. Haste means it'll be able to come down and make that clue, especially if you're curving out. While this card is by no means bad, it does feel kind of underwhelming for a Signpost uncommon that's supposed to be like a chase card for the red-white deck in the format, at least compared to the Signpost uncommons we get these days. It doesn't seem like the kind of Signpost that pulls you into the deck. Just seems like one you're happy to have when you're already in the deck, and I think that makes it a C+. Next up, it's Niv Mizzet Guild Pact, which costs 1 of each color of mana for a 6/6 legendary dragon avatar at rare. He's got flying and hexproof for multicolored, and when he deals combat damage to a player, he deals X damage to any target. Target player draws X cards and you gain X life, where X is the number of different color pairs among permanents you control that are exactly 2 colors. There's nice fixing in this set, so casting Niv Mizzet isn't impossible, and if he hits your opponent, X is fairly likely to be at least 1, and it will sometimes be 2, and that's going to generate some nice value. The problem, of course, is that casting Niv is difficult, and it's a bit of a bummer that after you work so hard to do that, he doesn't do something right away. But at least he has protection from multicolored, which means plenty of the removal in this set can't go after him. Still, the difficult casting cost and the setup you need for X to be a high number to begin with probably limits him to a C+. Next up, it's No More Lies, which for a white and a blue is an uncommon instant. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3 generic. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. A harder to cast mana leak, even with exile upside, isn't that great in limited. It can hit some stuff early, but being able to leave up this mana is far from a guarantee. Then the longer the game goes on, the less useful it is because your opponent's more likely to be able to pay the tax. I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Officious Interrogation, which for a white and a blue is a rare instant. It costs an additional white and blue to cast for each target beyond the first. Choose any number of target players, investigate X times, where X is the total number of creatures those players control. Well, this doesn't do anything but investigate, but as long as you're getting 2 clues out of it, you're going to feel kind of okay, and sometimes you're going to get a whole mountain of them for only 2 or 4 mana. Don't forget you can target yourself with this too. It's a little slow perhaps, but this seems like it will also give you a ton of cards in longer games, so I like it a reasonable amount, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Private Eye, which for a 1 generic, a white and a blue, is a 3/3 homunculus detective at uncommon. Other detectives you control get +1/+1, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, target detective can't be blocked this turn. This is a great lord. The set has a ton of detectives to buff, and plenty of clues that will help you make detectives unblockable. If you're in blue-white, it's going to be hard for this not to buff a huge chunk of your deck. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Rakdos, Patron of Chaos, which for 4 generic, a black and a red, is a 6/6 legendary demon at Mythic rare. It's got flying and trample, and at the beginning of your end step, target opponent may sacrifice 2 non-land, non-token permanents. If they don't, you draw 2 cards. This is great. He can end the game in a hurry, and most of the time when you play him, he's going to give you something before your opponent ever has a chance to remove him. The fact he only lets him sacrifice non-token, non-lands is important in a set with all these clues, and it makes the ability significantly stronger. If they choose to give you cards instead, you're pretty happy with that as well. So he's a huge, efficient creature that will deliver value even if your opponent has removal right away, and if they don't, they're just going to lose. He's an A+. Next up, it's Rakish Scoundrel, which for 2 generic, a black and a green, is a 3/3 elf rogue at common. It's got Death Touch. When it enters the battlefield or its turn face up, target creature gains indestructible until end of turn, and it has Disguise for 4 generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana. Unlike the other cards in this cycle, this one seems kind of medium. A 4-mana 3/3 Death Touch is probably a D. Sure, it can trade for anything, but that's really only exciting on cheap Death Touchers, and this is not one. And sure, this can grant indestructibility when it enters, or it can do it at instant speed if you have the mana for Disguise, which means this will kill whatever blocks it or that it blocks, and it can give itself indestructibility, so it can kill anything, but the Disguise cost is so expensive that that's not exactly a model of efficiency either. It seems like no matter how you play this, you're paying too much mana for it, and it's kind of situational. I think it's just a C-. Next up, it's Relive the Past, which for 5 generic, a green and a white, is a rare sorcery. Return up to 1 target artifact card, up to 1 target land card, up to 1 target non-or enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. They are 5/5 elemental creatures in addition to their other types. So in theory, when you cast this, you can have 3 5/5s that have additional upside, you know, whatever's in their text box. In practice, I think getting more than 1 sounds like a bit of a challenge, especially because green-white isn't exactly graveyard-centric in this format. While artifacts and enchantments are around, they aren't everywhere in this set, and artifacts will be especially hard to find in green-white, but I think you'll be able to get 2 5/5s out of this often enough, and occasionally get the full 3 for it to be a card worth playing at the top of your curve, but it's expensive and it takes some work, so I think it's just a C+. Next up, it's Repulsive Mutation, which for X, a green and a blue, is an uncommon instant. Put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, then counter up to 1 target spell unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. Counter spells can be sketchy in many limited formats because leaving up mana and hoping your opponent plays into it can be a pretty big problem. You have to be careful about using them. But this is effectively a modal spell, one that gets even better when you can use both modes. A green and a blue to counter a spell unless your opponent pays mana equal to the highest power of a creature you have in play isn't incredible, mostly because if you don't have a decent board state, it's effectively blank. But by adding in the +1/+1 counter stuff, it gives this card something to do even when your opponent doesn't play into your counter magic. And when they do, it's going to feel like a hard counter that adds a huge amount to your board. I think that modality, coupled with how powerful this is when you can reap the benefits of both parts of the card, do enough for me to be very interested in this card. In short, the times where this is a counterspell that adds to your board are going to feel insane, and the floor is acceptable. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Rift Burst Hellion, which for 5 generic, a red and a green, is a 6/7 Hellion at common. It's got Reach and Disguise for 4 generic and 2 red-green hybrid mana. This is another one that's not going to feel amazing either way you cast it, but the fact that it's a huge creature with the upside of being castable early as a 3-mana 2/2 with Ward 2 makes it worthwhile. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Runebrand Juggler, which for a black and a red is a 2/2 human shaman at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, suspect up to 1 target creature you control, and you can pay 3 generic, a black and a red, and sacrifice a suspected creature, and target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. Suspecting your creature might mean you get a good attack right away, and if nothing else, the Juggler can suspect itself. It is nice that it's a May trigger, so if you're in a spot where you need to block, you aren't in trouble. The activated ability is pretty good, especially if you're making tokens into suspects, something that doesn't seem particularly far-fetched, especially because he can do it for you. It won't feel nearly as good to give up real creatures to kill things with that ability, but that's not a terrible fail case. If you have a suspect in play and mana up, your opponent's going to be in kind of a nightmare scenario. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Sanguine Savior, which for 1 generic, a white, and a black is a 2/1 Vampire Cleric at common with flying and lifelink. It has Disguise for 2 black-white hybrid mana, and when it's turned face up, another target creature you control gains lifelink until end of turn. A 3-mana 2/1 with flying and lifelink is pretty decent. It won't always be able to get in there, but it will fairly often, and evasive lifelinkers are sweet because they really shift races in your favor. So, the fact that you can play this face down first and give something else lifelink too is nice upside to have. It's worth noting that black-white is one of the decks most interested in the disguise mechanic too, which probably gives it a little bump. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Shady Informant, which for 3 generic, a black and a red is a 4/2 Ogre Rogue at common. When it dies, it deals 2 damage to any target, and it has Disguise for 2 generic and 2 black-red hybrid mana. If you could only play this face up, it would be a card you would play. It has high enough power to trade with a lot of things, and the death trigger is likely to let you kill something else too, and that's a 2-for-1. So, the fact you can get this on the board earlier in the game without your opponent actually knowing it's lurking there makes it even nicer. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Soul Search, which for a white and a black mana is an uncommon sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, exile that card. If the card's mana value is 1 or less, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. This hits a wide enough variety of things to not be an entirely useless discard spell, and the fact that sometimes you get a token is pretty sweet. I do wish that if you also hit no card at all, you'd get the 1/1 token. That would probably be too good for constructed formats, but this still has the same problem most discard spells have in Limited, and that is that they have diminishing returns as the game goes longer. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Sumala Sentry, which for a green and a white is a 1/3 Elf Archer at uncommon. It's got reach. Whenever a face-down permanent you control is turned face up, put a +1/+1 counter on it and a +1/+1 counter on the Sentry. This is a pretty awesome payoff for disguising stuff. 2 counters added to whatever turn face up ability that card has, and of course the fact that you can turn those cards face up at instant speed can really make this a beating. I mean, if you have Sumala Sentry in play and even 1 face down creature in play and your mana's up, your opponent is going to have no idea what to do because the situation could be really, really, really bad for them. And then even if they don't attack into it, you could still turn the thing face up and then still get value. So this just looks like a really good signpost in common to me. It's really cheap, and I can't really see that many situations where it doesn't deliver more than 2 mana worth of value, giving it a B. Next up, it's Teysa, Opulent Oligarch, which for 1 generic, a white and a black, is a 2/3 Human Advisor at rare. She's got Death Touch. At the beginning of your end step, investigate for each opponent who lost life this turn. Whenever a clue you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. This ability triggers only once each turn. So, frequently you'll play her and get that first clue in the same turn. You're probably going to want to avoid playing her unless you can do that, unless you have nothing else you can do, because then you guarantee getting that first clue token. Then should she survive, you're also going to get a 1/1 flyer and draw a card. Overall, she seems like a pretty amazing value engine. Once you get that first 1/1 flyer, it's going to be easy for you to keep getting another clue because, you know, you have a 1/1 flyer who can get in and trigger her ability. She looks really good to me. I'm giving her a B+. Next up, it's Tin Street Gossip, which for 2 generic, a red and a green, is a 4/4 Viashino Advisor at uncommon. It's got Vigilance, and you can tap it to add red or green. Spend this mana only to cast face-down spells or to turn creatures face up. A 4-mana 4/4 with Vigilance is probably a C+ already. That's just a really nice stat line, a creature that can effectively pressure your opponent and protect you at the same time. So add to that the fact that this can tap for mana for your disguise stuff, and we're talking about a pretty good signpost in common. Red-green is one of the color pairs interested in disguise, obviously enough, and in particular, it's interested in the big old disguise creatures who, when you turn them face up, are 6/7s with reach and stuff like that, and Tin Street Gossip helps you get there a lot faster. And the fact that it can attack, and then you can leave it back and leave the mana up during your opponent's turn to turn your creature face up, or even turn a creature face up in the same combat using its ability, it's pretty awesome. Giving this a B. Next up, it's Tolsimir Midnight's Light, which for 2 generic, a green, and 2 white is a 3/2 Elf Scout at rare. He's got lifelink, and when he enters the battlefield, he creates Voja Fenstalker, a legendary 5/5 green and white wolf creature token with trample. And whenever a wolf you control attacks, if Tolsimir attacked this combat, target creature an opponent controls blocks that wolf this combat if able. 5 mana for a 3/2 lifelink and a 5/5 trampler is already pretty much a bomb. That's just an amazing rate. And his ability to make stuff block the wolf can come up sometimes too, but it does get most of its value just out of these 2 really nice bodies you get for the cost. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Treacherous Greed, which for 1 generic, a white and a black, is a rare instant. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice a creature that dealt damage this turn, draw 3 cards, each opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. If you can set this up, it's pretty amazing. It's 3 mana for a lightning helix to your opponent's dome and 3 cards. The good news is, this is pretty easy to set up too. That's because the creature you sacrifice just has to have dealt damage. This will count doing damage to creatures. Your creature does not have to hit your opponent for you to be able to cast this. So this means most of the time when you turn a creature sideways, that creature will be sacrificable to this, provided it survives combat. So there is setup here, and it's not automatic, but the upside is real and the setup is attainable. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Tristani 3 Whispers, which for a green-white hybrid mana, and a white mana, is a 4/4 legendary dryad at Mythic Rare. You can pay 1 generic and a green, and target creature gains Death Touch until end of turn. You can pay a green-white hybrid mana, and target creature gains Vigilance until end of turn. Or you can pay 2 generic and a white, and target creature gains Double Strike until end of turn. This has above-rate stats, and the ability to grant these keywords is awesome, especially because it can use the abilities on itself. The threat of activation is very real, and your opponent really has to think about Death Touch and Double Strike when making their decisions. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Undercover Crocodile, which for 4 generic, a green and a blue, is a 5/5 elf crocodile detective at common. When it deals combat damage to a player, you investigate, and it has Disguise for 3 generic and 2 green-blue hybrid mana. So, without Disguise, this would not be very good. A 6 mana 5/5 just doesn't move the needle, especially one that can only do something when it hits your opponent. Disguise does enough to make this solid, though, because you can get it on the board much earlier, and you can find a way to sneak it in and get that clue more easily, giving it a C. Next up, it's Urgent Necropsy. For 2 generic, a black and a green, it's a Mythic Rare instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, collect evidence X, where X is the total mana value of the permanents this spell targets. Destroy up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, and up to 1 target planeswalker. You'll almost never have a planeswalker to destroy with this, but you'll basically always have a creature, and enchantments and artifacts aren't far-fetched in this format either. Most frequently, you'll probably just take down a creature with this at instant speed, and it takes some pretty real setup, but that setup does look obtainable in black-green decks. This will feel nuts when you can hit 3 permanents with it, and your graveyard is stocked for you to do that, but your opponent has to have those, and you have to have the right cards in your graveyard to pull it off. So this has a high ceiling, but kind of a mediocre floor. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Vannifar Evolved Enigma. For 2 generic, a green and a blue, it's a 3/4 Elf Ooze Wizard at Mythic Rare. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose one. Cloak a card from your hand, or put a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature you control. The second effect here can buff all of your morphs and or artifact creatures, which there are plenty of in the format. Cloaking things from your hand is nice too. It'll feel the best in the mid to late game when you don't really need your lands anymore and you can turn your excess lands into 2/2s. Using it on an actual creature won't feel quite as good, but if it's one that you can't cast yet anyway, it's going to feel fine. And using it on like a removal spell is obviously something you never want to do. It is nice that you go to combat and you get one of these effects right away, so she will frequently do something the turn she comes down. I'm giving her a B+. Next up, it's War Leader's Call, which for 1 generic, a red and a white, is a rare enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Anthems are good when you have lots of creatures, and the incidental damage this can chip in can really turn up the heat on your opponent. But still, it's not the kind of card that does much unless you've already got a decent board. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Wisp Drinker Vampire, which for 2 generic, a white and a black, is a 2/4 uncommon vampire rogue with flying. And whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And you can pay 5 generic, a white, and a black, and creatures you control with power 2 or less gain Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn. This has respectable stats, and the Life Drain effect is going to be easier than normal to trigger because all of your disguised creatures, when you play them face down, will trigger it. I like that it has an ability for the extreme late game too. If nothing else, it'll be giving itself Death Touch and Lifelink, and most of the time it'll be doing more than that. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's World Soul's Rage, which for X, a red and a green, is a rare sorcery. It deals X damage to any target. Put up to X land cards from your hand and or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. As with most X damage spells, this is never really going to feel efficient, but it does scale as the game goes on, and being able to go after your opponent makes it an effective finisher. Additionally, there might be times where you've milled a couple of lands early, and you just use this to kill an X2 and ramp your mana, and that's not a bad mode to have on a card that's already worth playing. I'm giving this a B. Next, there's Yaris, Roar of the Old Gods, which for 2 generic, a red and a green, is a 4/4 Centaur Druid at rare. Other creatures you control have haste. Whenever one or more face-down creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. Whenever a face-down creature you control dies, return it to the battlefield face down, under its owner's control, if it's a permanent card, then turn it face up. I'm already pretty happy about a 4-mana 4/4 that gives haste to your stuff, so the fact that this has insane face-down card synergy is awesome. If you've got a disguised creature and you attack with it with Yaris in play, your opponent either has to let it through and let you draw a card, or block it and probably kill it, and pray that the disguised creature won't be that scary when it comes back. Of course, if the best they can do is trade with a 2-toughness creature, that will be an especially brutal beating. The whole haste thing combos nicely here too, because it means your disguised creatures will make your opponent make those decisions even more quickly. I think you're going to have a face-down creature in play often enough when you play Yaris that he does sneak into the lower bomb range, because you're likely to make your opponent immediately make one of those choices, giving him an A-. Alright, the last few multicolored cards we have are all split cards that have hybrid costs. With split cards, you can choose to cast one side or the other. The first one is Cease and Desist. The Cease side is an instant that costs 1 generic and a black-green hybrid mana. It says exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. Target player gains 2 life and draws a card. The other side, Desist, is 4 generic and 2 green-white hybrid mana. For an uncommon sorcery, destroy all artifacts and enchantments. So the fact that these are all hybrid mana is really nice, just like the disguised creatures with hybrid mana are really nice, because these will fit into a wider variety of decks than they would otherwise. And some of these are going to have one side that's good enough that if you can't cast both, it isn't a disaster. Though I think most of the time you will be able to cast both sides, at least some of the time. So the C side here lets you hate on the graveyard while replacing itself, which probably wouldn't be good enough to make the main deck in this format. The Desist side is more situational, but there are definitely going to be board states in this format where it really does something. And most of the time when you get to 6 mana, it has a pretty good chance at destroying something, just hopefully not your stuff. You know, either of these cards individually just wouldn't be that good, but having this modality is a big deal, and I think it makes it playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Flotsam and Jetsam, which for 1 generic and a green-blue hybrid mana. The Flotsam side is an uncommon instant. It says mill 3 cards, investigate. The Jetsam side is 4 generic and 2 blue-black hybrid mana. It's a sorcery, and it says each opponent mills 3 cards. Then you may cast a spell from each opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If a spell cast this way would be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. So this is a pretty similar design to the first one we saw. The Flotsam side does something early, and it's not that powerful. It helps you set up graveyard shenanigans, and it replaces itself. And the Jetsam side gives you a free spell. Neither are going to feel like the most efficient thing in the world in most cases. You have to pay 4 total mana to mill 3 and draw a card with Flotsam in the end, and Jetsam isn't usually going to give you back the mana you spent. Having both makes a big difference. That's what is great about split cards. Both plays might be kind of mediocre, but the fact remains you have a card that does something useful early and something useful late, and most cards don't have that kind of flexibility, giving this a C. Next up, it's Fuss and Bother, which for 2 generic and a red-white hybrid mana. The Fuss side is an instant, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. And the Bother side is 4 generic and 2 blue-white hybrid mana for a sorcery, and it makes 3/1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying, Surveil 2. The Fuss mode can be really strong if you're going wide and you're the beatdown. Meanwhile, Bother is maybe less efficient, but also less situational. 6 mana for 3/1/1 flyers in Surveil 2 isn't amazing, but you're also fairly unlikely to die after you cast it thanks to those 3 bodies, and Surveil 2 makes it pretty likely you're going to draw something meaningful. This one looks really good to me. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Hustle and Bustle. The Hustle side is an instant for 1 blue-red hybrid mana. Target creature attacks or blocks this turn if able. The Bustle side is 4 generic and 2 red-green hybrid mana for a sorcery, and creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. You may turn a creature you control face up. I like the design here too. Individually, each side of this is way too situational to be particularly good on its own, but when you have 2 modes on one card, it makes a big difference. The Hustle side is very narrow, but the times when it lines up right, it'll feel like removal. Bustle is also situational, but when it's good, it's a game ender, as overrun effects often are, and you even get to turn something face up, which red-green decks are going to be particularly interested in doing. So chances are good you'll get sufficient value out of one side of this card to make it pretty nice, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Push and Pull, which for 1 generic and a black-white hybrid mana, the push side is a sorcery, destroys a tapped creature. The pull side is 4 generic and 2 black-red hybrid mana for a sorcery that says, put up to 2 target creature cards from a single graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. They gain haste until end of turn. Sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. So the push half is probably where you're going to get like 90% of the value here, as it's a solid removal spell, like a C+ level removal spell on its own, which is better than like one side of most of these cards are. Most of them would be Cs or worse if they were only that card. But in this case, you have a pretty good one. And then the pull half in the late game can potentially be completely insane. It's sort of like the overrun effect we just saw, except the other side of this card is way better than the other side of the other one. It does make you only choose 2 cards from a single graveyard, but you can choose either graveyard, and there are going to be spots where you can grab 2 really good things out of 1 graveyard, and it's enough to give you lethal the same way an overrun effect is. So I think this one's another really good uncommon, giving it a B. All right, so that does it for the multicolored cards. Let's move now into the artifacts, starting with Cryptex, which for 2 generic is a rare artifact. You can tap it and collect evidence 3, add 1 mana of any color, put an unlock counter on Cryptex, and you can sacrifice it, surveil 3, and draw 3, activate only if Cryptex has 5 or more unlock counters on it. This is awful for limited. It's effectively a blank card if your graveyard doesn't have what you need, so the fact that you can play this mana rock on turn 2 doesn't really matter, because it'll rarely be able to produce mana on turn 2. It's exciting to imagine getting those 5 counters on it and cracking it to draw 3, but that's going to take quite a lot of time if you even do it at all. This is an F. Next up, it's Gravestone Strider, which for 2 generic is a 1/3 artifact creature golem at common. You can pay 1 generic and add 1 mana of any color, activate only once each turn, and you can pay 2 and exile it from your graveyard to exile a card from a graveyard. This is a nice little Swiss Army knife. When 1 mana filtering is attached to a creature, it's performed pretty well, and this even comes with the addition of Graveyard Hate, something that certainly matters, giving it a C. Next up, it's Lumbering Laundry, which for 5 generic is a 4/5 artifact creature golem at uncommon. You can pay 2 generic, and until end of turn, you may look at face-down creatures you don't control anytime, and it has Disguise for 5 generic. So we've seen in past sets with face-down creatures that being able to look at your opponent's face-down cards isn't really worth spending mana. Sure, the information is nice, and there's worse things you could sink your mana into, but you only end up using this when you reach a point where there's literally nothing else you can do. Still, this is a reasonable disguised creature. It has an easy-to-cast, reasonably statted body, and knowing what all face-down things are, like in the late stage of the game, certainly doesn't hurt. I think it's probably a C. Next up, it's Magnetic Snuffler, which for 5 generic is a 4/4 artifact creature construct at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you return target equipment card from your graveyard to the battlefield attached to Magnetic Snuffler, and whenever you sack an artifact, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Snuffler. This set does have equipment at uncommon that sacrifice themselves for various effects. Most of them are clues, and that's kind of what this can interact with. That would be really sweet. And there's a decent amount of self-mill in the format that might put that equipment in your graveyard too, but I still wouldn't count on triggering that Enter the Battlefield ability all that often. When you can, it'll feel great. I think most of the value comes from the fact that it grows when you sacrifice artifacts like clues, but the fact it starts out as a 5 mana 4/4 makes it hard for me to feel great about this card. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Magnifying Glass, which for 3 generic is a common artifact. It can tap for colorless. You can pay 4 generic and tap it to investigate. This is a reprint, and it was bad last time we saw it. 3 mana rocks just don't tend to be good in limited, especially when they aren't fixing your mana. And while this has another mode where it can start investigating for you, it's really expensive and only something you're going to do when you're out of things to do, and spending 6 mana to draw a card isn't exactly a great deal. I think this is a D-. Next up, it's Sanitation Automaton, which for 2 generic is a 2/1 artifact creature construct at common. When it enters the battlefield, you surveil 1. So the stat line here is inefficient, and surveil 1 isn't exactly impressive. This just doesn't do enough to be worth the mana, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Thinking Cap, which for 1 generic is a common artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+2. You can equip it to a detective for 1 mana, and you can equip it to anything else for 3 mana. If this were always one to equip, it would probably be a C, just because that's a decent boost, one that's easy to move around. And detectives are plentiful enough in this format that I think it's still good enough to be a C-. Right, let's move into lands now. Starting with Branch of Vitu-Ghazi, which is an uncommon land that can tap for colorless. It has Disguise for 3 generic, so yes, this is a land you can play as a creature. And whenever it's turn face up, you add 2 mana of any one color. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. This is a neat design. If you just need the mana right away, you can play it. But this has 2 other really nice functions. First, it's flood insurance. The last thing you want to draw in the late game is a land, but at least this one can be played face down as a 3 mana 2/2 that can block or whatever else you really need. And in like the mid game when you might need fixing, turning it face up has value too. Remember, you can do weird stuff like assign this to block and then turn it face up, at which point you get the mana and the creature it blocked is still considered blocked, but you don't lose the land. So yeah, I mean, I think this land does enough little things that it's a C+. So next up, I have Commercial District, which is a stand-in for a cycle of 10 rare lands, all of which surveil 1 when they enter the battlefield, tapped, and have 2 basic land types, and of course they can tap for mana that those 2 types can tap for. Commercial District, for example, is a mountain forest that can tap for red or green. These are all really nice fixing, and Surveil 1 has real value in a format with a graveyard mechanic that's as prominent as Collect Evidence is. And there's even a few cards in the set that will let you grab these because of their land types. I'm giving these a C+. Next up, it's Escape Tunnel, which is a common land. You can tap it and sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And you can tap it and sacrifice it to make target creature with power 2 or less unblockable this turn. So this is strictly better Evolving Wilds. Evolving Wilds is always a pretty nice land to have because for no mana at all, it allows you to fix your mana. And that's what you're going to use this for, probably about 90% of the time. But having this extra ability is pretty nice for a few reasons. First, drawing Evolving Wilds late is kind of a bummer, and this can at least do something. But the interaction that's really interesting here is that you can use this to make your morph, or disguise creature rather, unblockable, and then, you know, attack with it and turn it face up. That's going to have an impact on some games, so, you know, the upside here is there. It's not going to be something that you always access or even always want to access. It's the fixing you're looking for the most, but that alternate mode matters. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Public Thoroughfare, which is a common land. It enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it, unless you tap an untapped artifact or land you control, and it can add 1 mana of any color. This set has a lot of pretty good fixing lands. You know, we don't have a cycle of lands that produce 2 colors of mana like we often do in Ravnica at Common, but there's a bunch of common and uncommon lands with good fixing, and I think this is another one. You have to jump through a few hoops, but being able to only tap a clue sounds pretty appealing. And, you know, even tapping another land isn't terrible in a lot of situations. There will be times where this is a little too slow and clunky, but I think it's a C. Next up, it's Scene of the Crime, which is an uncommon artifact land clue. It enters the battlefield tapped, and it can tap for colorless, but you can tap it and tap an untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any color, and because it's a clue, you can also pay 2 and sacrifice it to draw a card. This looks pretty nice. You're not always going to want to tap your creature to make mana, as that is a real cost, but this can also produce colorless mana normally, so it isn't a land that like only works if you have the right setup. Then, because it's a clue, it has flood insurance attached to it where, you know, you can effectively just cycle this, you know, throw it away, draw another card. It's also an artifact, which matters. It's also a clue, which matters. So it just does a lot of nice stuff in this format. So I think it's another land that's a C+. So those are all the colorless and multicolored cards in Murders at Karlov Manor. Tomorrow, I'll be back with a look at all the white ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure you're caught up on the set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, while also getting some set review related perks, you can do so by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find how to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.